So we're gonna be in Genesis 37. I'm gonna give you a little warning. Last service was the service where everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. We had technical difficulties. I dropped my notes. I lost my page. It was a mess. So we're gonna hope that that was just the dress rehearsal, and that this one's gonna go a whole lot more smoothly. So we're gonna be in Genesis 37. We're talking about the weight of envy, the weight of jealousy, and what I want to be sure that we recognize is we have these four young men and women here that are going on to this next step. I want to speak to you four particularly right now and to tell you something, that to seek God, to follow Him in your lives, the number one thing that you have to recognize is that God has uniquely prepared for you a journey. He's uniquely set a course out for you, and it's yours, and it's not anyone else's. And I know that all of the adults in this room can speak to the fact that as you go through that journey, if you take your eyes off of what God has for you and you start looking at what God is doing in the lives of others or what God has for someone else, it can lead to a world of hurt. It can lead to a lot of confusion. It can lead to disappointment. And so as we celebrate what God's doing in their lives, here's what I encourage you graduates to do. Walk out your faith. You're going to go through a difficult season of something you may not have experienced before, is that your faith has to be your faith. It can't be mom and dad's faith. It's got to be your own. You've got to own it. You've got to possess it. It's got to come from inside of you. And don't get caught up in what we're going to talk about today, and that is the trap of looking at everyone else. Don't get caught up in the trap of envy. God created you for a purpose, for a reason. Stay true to that. You know, I heard recently about a grocery store owner who was directly across the street from his top competitor. There were two men who owned these rival grocery stores, and they did everything that they could do to one-up each other each and every day. And so in a small town, they would watch, and every customer that went in their opponent's grocery store, you know, they'd kind of sneer and snarl and make faces at each other. They would try to have better deals, better bargains. The competition became so severe, so fierce, that they were just embroiled in this envy, this jealousy. They couldn't even focus on the good things that were going on in their lives. And so one day, an angel appeared to one of these men, one of these store owners, and said, you know what, I'd like to offer a blessing, a gift to you. I want to grant you any desire, any wish, any blessing that you could ask for, but here is the one stipulation. Anything you request from God that's granted to you, the guy across the street's going to get twice as much. Anything that you ask for, any blessing that you receive, your competitor is going to get a double portion of what you receive. And so the man thought, and he pondered this and really took in what this meant, what the ramifications were, and he finally settled on this. He said, I wish to be blind in one eye. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. See, that's what jealousy does. He's going to get double the guy across the street, so he would be, okay. That's exactly what jealousy does, doesn't it? What jealousy does is it takes our eyes off of the blessings that we're receiving. It takes our perspective off of what we have in store, and it makes us focus on what someone else has. It makes us focus on something that's completely out of our control. How insidious is envy? It's so bad that Paul the apostle, when he's listing out some of the most evil, despicable works of the flesh, and there's some awful stuff in there, guess what's right at the heart of that list? Envy, in Galatians chapter 5. You see, envy is a toxin. It's a toxin that poisons us. It poisons our soul. It puts us at odds with other people. And the scary thing about envy, about jealousy, is it clouds our ability to see things clearly. One writer even said envy is the last sin that Christians will confess because of how completely ugly it is. You see, we don't see jealousy, we don't see envy in our own eyes, and from our own perspective, and when we do, we sure don't want to call it what it is. We'll call it by any other name. You see, jealousy and envy, I'm going to use these terms interchangeably, but they're the same thing, and here's what envy is. Envy is when we count other people's blessings instead of our own. Jealousy is when we're more concerned with someone else's blessings than we are about our own. And here's the thing about envy is nobody has to teach us how to do it. No one has to teach us to desire something that someone else gets. You see, we got 3 kids in our house, and guess what? When one receives something really cool, it doesn't take much for envy to sprout up. You know, it's one of those things where I never even realized how much I wanted something until my brother got it, right? That's the way it goes. But see, no one has to teach us how to be envious. No one has to teach us how to be jealous. But here's the thing, unchecked jealousy will absolutely ruin your walk. It will ruin your ability to connect with God. It will ruin your closeness with the Lord. Your intimate moments with Him will be poisoned, and you won't be able to experience and see the blessings that He has for your own life. So in Genesis 37, we're going to be looking at the story of Joseph, and this is a story that is absolutely filled with envy. You see, Joseph went in his life everywhere from the very pit, the bottom of a pit, to the pinnacle, the absolute peak. He becomes the second most powerful man in Egypt at the time, possibly even the second most powerful man in the world. And throughout that story, God was at work. From the deepest, darkest lows to the highest highs, God was working in his life. But the thing that put him in that pit was the envy of who? His brothers. His brothers. So let's read in Genesis chapter 37, verse 3. Now Israel would be the name of Joseph's father, which is who? Jacob. Okay, good job. Jacob, Israel, loved Joseph more than his other sons, because Joseph was a son born to him in his old age. And he made a long-sleeved robe for him. Other translations, your translation may say a coat of many colors. It was fancy. It was something that was symbolic. Verse 4 says, when his brothers saw that their father loved him, Joseph, more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him. Then, verse 5, Joseph had a dream. When he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. There we were, binding sheaves of grain in the field. Suddenly my sheaf stood up, and your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. Are you really going to reign over us? His brothers asked him. Are you really going to rule us? So they hated him even more because of his dream and what he had said. Verse 9, then he had another dream and told it to his brothers. Look, he said, I had another dream. And this time the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. He told his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him. What kind of dream is it that you have had? He said. Am I and your mother and your brothers really going to come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. You see, what we're going to look at today through this story is we're going to look at jealousy. We're going to look at 3 characteristics of jealousy, 3 characteristics of envy. We're going to look at 5 consequences of unchecked envy and jealousy in our lives. And then finally, our application is going to be 4 steps for cures, 4 steps for relief, 4 steps for a release from the burden of envy, the burden of jealousy. So the first thing that we want to recognize here, the first characteristic of jealousy is this. Jealousy can't tolerate others doing well. Jealousy cannot tolerate others doing well. Notice in this story, in verses 3 and 4, what we see is that the blessing that Joseph received is the source of his brother's envy. And if you look at the history of this family, what we see is generation after generation after generation, there is envy upon strife. This is the epitome of a dysfunctional family. Hey, guess what? If you come from a dysfunctional family, welcome to the club. But notice, the Bible is full of these stories too, and God can use you even in the midst of that. You see, there's a history of envy. From the pit to the pinnacle, what we see is that God's hand was on Joseph. But this history of envy starts very back from the beginning. Jacob, Joseph's father, if you'll remember, his mother, Rebekah, had played a trick on him. She had led her son, Jacob, to steal the birthright of his brother. Who is his brother? Esau. And so there was a deception there. There was envy. So Esau envied Jacob, and it was years before there was ever reconciliation there. Jacob, as he grew up, he moved out and he lived in the land of his uncle Laban. And his flocks multiplied and grew, and God's hand was upon him, and his uncle began to envy him. He was envious of all of the ways that the Lord was blessing him. And all the way back to Cain and Abel, what we see is a history of envy. If you remember, both men brought their sacrifice to the Lord, but God was pleased at the heart of Abel's sacrifice. And so, out of envy, out of jealousy, what did Cain do? He killed his very brother. You see, the story, envy is not something that we have to work hard to think up. It comes very naturally to us. Jacob sets his son up. You would have thought that all of the dysfunction that Jacob had experienced, the last thing that he would want to do is set his son up for this. But he does. He sets his son up to be the object of scorn. He sets his son up to be the object of envy. Look at verse 3. Now Israel, Jacob loved Joseph more than his other sons, because Joseph was a son born to him in his old age. If you'll remember, he didn't think he was going to have any more children. In fact, Joseph was the son of Jacob's favorite wife, the one he truly loved, Rachel, who had gone on to die. And so as a result, I believe that when he saw his son Joseph, he was reminded of this woman, Rachel, who he loved so much. And as a result, he made him this special robe, this special coat of many colors. And the thing about it is, it probably would have been long. It wouldn't have been the coat of someone who would have had to work in the field. And so imagine this, day in, day out, here are these brothers striving out in the field. They're working, they're toiling, and what does little brother get to do? The baby always has it the easiest, don't they? Just ask the older siblings. And they're envious, they're jealous, it's not fair, and we see that it's not fair. We recognize that it's not fair. And here's the other thing about this coat was a symbol of something. This coat symbolized the fact that even though Joseph was number 11, he was going to be the one who received the birthright. He was going to be the one who received all of his father's blessing. Even though he was number 11, he was going to receive everything of his father's. Verse 4 says, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him. At this stage, Joseph is about 17 years old, and Joseph is either a goody two-shoes or he's just really naive. But the beginning of this chapter says that he basically rats out his brothers, that they haven't been doing what their father has asked them to do. So not only is he spoiled, but he also tells the truth no matter what's going on, and his brothers despise him for it. Here's what I believe we can see from this. Family is often the most prime breeding ground for envy, isn't it? Isn't that ironic? The people that we are closest to, the people that we are joined to by blood, are often the people that we envy the greatest at times. And it's such an ironic thing. Joseph had given a bad report of his brothers to Jacob, and his brothers absolutely despised him. You know what didn't help? Were these dreams that Joseph was having. The second characteristic of jealousy that we see is jealousy is hostile to those who have never harmed us. Jealousy is hostile to those who have never harmed us. Now, you might be looking at this thing and saying, but look at all the things that he did. He didn't have to work. He didn't have to, tell them about these dreams. But in verse 5, it says, then Joseph had a dream, and he told his brothers. They hated him even more. Let me ask you, does telling a dream, does that necessarily hurt someone? Does it harm someone else? Did he actively do anything to go against his brothers? No. All he did was give a report of a dream that had been given to him. It was truly prophecy. It was given to him by God. And by sharing the dream, that was all it took for them to be filled with hatred toward their brothers. You see, jealousy is hostile to those who have never harmed us. Often, what we see is a perceived harm. What we become jealous of often is just the blessing that someone else is receiving, even though typically they haven't done anything to us. You see, Jacob had sons from 4 different wives. If you remember, Jacob was made into an agreement, and he really loved Rachel. He wanted to marry Rachel, but he was deceived into marrying Leah, so it was kind of a package deal. And when neither of them could conceive, he took the handmaidens Zilpah and Bilhah. Those are beautiful names. And what happens is he has sons with these women before eventually having Joseph from the one he truly loved, which is Rachel. And so what happens is Joseph's, he was doted on, he was given all of the greatest things, but he also had a moral compass. You see, something was incredible about Joseph. He always did the right thing. And sometimes the most frustrating thing in the world is when somebody is always doing the right thing, especially when we're in our sin, right? When we see someone's blessing on their life because they're truly walking it out with God, if I'm in my sin, that drives me crazy. And I believe that's what's going on with these brothers here. And Joseph was brutally honest with what had been going on in his life. He was brutally honest about what God had shown him. And we don't know if he meant to get under his brother's skin, but for whatever reason, everything that he said, even though it was shown by God, shown to him by God, it drove his brothers crazy. You see, Joseph was the son of Rachel, the only woman that Jacob ever really loved, and the coat signified that he was giving him the rights and privileges of not the 11th born son, but the firstborn son. So in giving the robe, what he was essentially doing was he was showing to the other 10 sons that none of you, not Reuben, the firstborn, not Simeon, not Judah, but number 11 is going to get all the rights and the privileges. You know what? If any of us were the older brothers, guess how we'd be feeling too? Pretty jealous, right? Pretty upset. That doesn't seem fair. Here's the third characteristic that we see is that jealousy fails to recognize what God knows. Jealousy fails to recognize what God knows. Essentially, what jealousy is saying that we know better than God on how things should be distributed. Look at verse 10. He told his father and brothers, and his father rebuked him. Even Jacob said, you know what? You really shouldn't be saying these things out loud. Do you have a death wish? Come on, kid. He says, what kind of dream is this that you have had? He said, am I and your mother and your brothers really going to come and bow down on the ground before you? But look what it says in verse 11. His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. You see, here's what I believe that Jacob realized. Is that what Joshua was reporting was actually the truth of what was going to happen. This was prophecy that was divinely inspired by God. I believe that Jacob sensed that. I believe that Jacob had a perception of that. While Joseph's dreams didn't earn him any points with his brothers, he was definitely naive, but what envy does is it puts us at the center of the universe. Greed says, I want more, but envy says, I want you to have less. Proverbs 27:4 says, what is cruel? Wrath is cruel, anger is overwhelming, but who can stand before jealousy? Who can stand before jealousy? You see, every single one of us knows exactly what it feels like to just be festering. Think about this. How many times have you experienced maybe you've lost your job and someone else who didn't work as hard receives a promotion? Maybe they get a raise. Maybe they get moved up to a place of prominence, become a supervisor over you, and you know that you deserved that better. What are we essentially saying? We're saying that we know we don't recognize what God knows. That maybe somehow, even in that happening, that God has a plan. That somehow in the cosmic scale of things that God is giving out blessings to people who don't deserve them. What about the fact when your child gets in trouble and someone else's child gets a full ride scholarship? It cuts, it hurts. We understand what that feeling is like. But what happens if that continues to go unchecked? Skip Heitzig, a pastor, put it this way. If you're prone to envy, get this, church, if this is you, if you have a target on someone else's back and you are prone to envy over one particular person, get this, Here's my warning to you, that if you are prone to envy, God may give you, I love this, a first row seat to his work in others' lives. Isn't that true? If you are prone to envy, God may give you a first row seat to his work in someone else's lives. Your envy does not stop God's work in another person's life. You can live honorably regardless of your environment. Church, here's what I want you to see. You cannot blame where you are today on the actions of other people, as tempting as that may be. We have to trust God, trust what he's doing, and trust that just maybe he has a divine appointment for you to be in a pit for a while. Just maybe you didn't receive that promotion because he's got a different path for you that's only going to be accomplished for you to be in this place for a time, for a season. I'm so thankful. Anybody else thankful for the times that they failed? Thankful for the times that they've fallen flat on their face because it was the only way that God could reveal to them something that we really, truly needed to learn. But it's hard. It's hard to learn those lessons. You see, Jacob sees that his son has a legitimate prophecy here. He senses that. And we can argue with Joseph's decision to share, but God knew what kind of man he was blessing. I believe he saw the character of Joseph. The next thing we want to look at is the consequences of jealousy. What are the consequences of jealousy? We already saw that jealousy is going to put us in a front row seat to what he is doing in someone else's life. But the first thing we want to recognize is the consequence of jealousy is a loss of joy. If I am fixated on what God is doing in your life, and I believe that you are receiving things that are entitled to me, guess what I am no longer able to do? Experience any joy for the things that are going on in my life. It's pretty true, isn't it? I'm so focused on what you are getting, what you are receiving, I'm not paying attention to what God is doing in my life. And so what happens is we have this blank in our lives, this I'll be happy if I have this. I'll be happy if I would be happy if I just had this. If I only had this, when I see someone else having this, then I will truly be happy. Fill in the blank with whatever that needs to be. A promotion, a child, a marriage. If whatever it is that God has put on your heart, if you've got this blank and you see someone else receive it, you are constantly going to be reminded of the fact that you don't have joy. You see, this causes us to chase after everything except God. In Luke 15, we hear of the prodigal son. The prodigal son, he has a perfect, content, wonderful life, but he throws it all away because he believes, I will be happy if I'm able to chase after all these things. I will be happy if I can pursue this living that's been denied to me all this time. I'll take my inheritance early. And where does he find himself? He finds himself in a pig trough. What he thought was happiness was really emptiness. It was despair. We see Solomon, and he's been blessed with the greatest wealth of any man alive. And what does he do? He pursues everything. He pursues building things to make his legacy greater. He pursues wine. He pursues women. He pursues laughter and everything. And what does he come to at the end of his rope, at the end of his line? When he has pursued all of it, he says it's all meaningless. It's all vanity. That nothing he pursued was really fulfilling. Church, even if you don't hear anything else I say today, if you get this, we will have gotten something here. Anything you put in that blank that is not a relationship with Jesus Christ that you think is going to satisfy or make you complete or whole, guess what? I'll save you a lot of trouble. It's not going to fulfill. If it's not a relationship with Jesus Christ that you are pursuing that's going to be that thing that makes you complete, it will lead you to emptiness. And when you see someone else who gets it, it's just going to make you have a loss of joy. You see, you're not going to find happiness apart from a relationship with God. Graduates, make sure you take note of that. You're not going to find happiness apart from a relationship with God. That's why you were created. It's what you were created for. You see, the presence of love in our lives isn't going to coexist with envy. 1 Corinthians 13:4, Paul is talking about love, and we see this at weddings all the time, but verse 4 says, love is patient, love is kind, love does not what? Envy. You see, love in your heart, to love others and to envy, it does not coexist. Those two things, they don't function in the same space at the same time. Love isn't boastful. It's not arrogant. So your capacity to love others is going to be absolutely tarnished by the envy that you have in your heart. They cannot coexist. The second consequence of jealousy is that envy is going to attempt to even the score. There's something called the mirror principle that I think is really true, and that's that God can use jealousy in our hearts to reveal the things that are going on inside of our hearts. You see, the things that we are jealous for reveals exactly what it is that's an idol in our life. What is it that makes you jealous? What is it that you're constantly consumed with? What is the thing that you're pursuing over a relationship that is becoming your idol? It's a mirror to what's truly the thing that you're living for. Paul Tripp put it this way: envy is self-focused and self-righteous. It inserts you into the center of your world. It makes it all about you. It tells you that you deserve what you don't deserve. Envy is expectant and demanding. Envy tells you that you are someone you aren't and you are entitled to what is not rightfully yours. Envy cannot celebrate the blessing of another because it tells you that you are more deserving. Envy tells you that you have earned what you could never earn. The world of envy no more mixes with the world of grace than oil does with water. Envy forgets who you are, forgets who God is, and is confused about what life is all about. I love that. The world of envy no more mixes with the world of grace than oil does with water. You see, when we're consumed with envy, we're not consumed with the fact that we are a recipient of incredible grace. That should be the heart of how we function, how we live our lives. But it's like oil and water. They don't mix. The third thing that we see that's a consequence of envy is a comparison mindset. There's a thing called the crab buckets principle. Anybody ever heard of this? You put a bunch of crabs in a bucket, fill it with water, and guess what happens? No crab is going to get out of that bucket. You know why? It's not because they're not trying. What happens when one of them starts to make it towards the top? The rest of them pull them right back down. That's exactly what happens in life. When we have a comparison mindset, it drives us crazy to see others who are advancing, who are receiving blessings, and instead of being joyful for that person, we spend our lives comparing ourselves, measuring ourselves against what we see and what we think other people have, and nothing feeds into this dynamic more than social media. What we've determined, what sociologists and psychologists are figuring out is that the like button is quite possibly the most damaging invention of all time. The like button is nothing but a measuring stick by which we compare our popularity, our worthiness to the world. And I wish I could say it was something that just teens struggle with, but it's not. You see, social media, I just heard a story this week, and this is just, it's crazy that this is the world we live in. Maybe you saw this too. A 28-year-old woman disguised herself as a high school student and went inside of a high school so that she could gain Instagram followers. That's crazy, isn't it? She pretended to be a high school student so that she could get more likes and a following on social media. See, we've completely broken what we see as being success, what we see as being validation. When we look to the world to fill us up, we're always going to come back empty. There's a comparison mindset. The fourth thing that I want us to see as a consequence is unwanted suspicion and anger. Unwanted suspicion and anger. You see, Joseph, what did his brothers eventually do to him? They throw him in a pit. They wanted to kill him. They wanted to actually take his life, but one of the other brothers convinced them, you know what, we could sell him off. We could throw him in a pit. We could sell him off and make a profit. They throw him into a pit. They leave him for dead. Was Joseph really, truly a threat to his brothers? No. But they could not exist in a world where Joseph was receiving blessings and they were not. Nora, you're going to love this one. We like to watch musicals in our household, and Nora's favorite is the musical Hamilton. And there was reminded of a verse from one of the songs this week, and that's in the story. It's based on true life. There was a man named Alexander Hamilton who was the Treasury Secretary of the United States, and he had this rival who constantly looked to him and wanted to be exactly like him, who was tortured by the fact that this man was successful and he was not. His name was Aaron Burr, and it eventually led to them basically Burr killing Hamilton in a duel, but there's a song where he says he realizes that the world was big enough for both Hamilton and me. The world was big enough for both of us. And isn't that the truth? Don't we forget that sometimes? that the world is actually big enough that if someone else is receiving accolades and being successful, that does not take away from your ability to see those things. But are we going to live with enough grace to be able to applaud that? And the final thing I want us to see is that the consequence of envy is a critical spirit. A critical spirit. You see, nothing will interrupt your ability to love the Lord, to walk with Jesus, than this critical spirit that comes from a hardened heart. Paul Tripp goes on to say, we proclaim on Sunday that God is wise, but we question his decisions and live in fear of the unknown. This is what a critical spirit does to us. We look around at other people and see what they have or don't have in the case of suffering and wish that God was just a little bit smarter. If the Lord was truly wise, he would have known that what I am suffering through wasn't the best thing for me. He would never claim to believe that theology in public, but those thoughts will run through our brains and seep into our heart. If the Lord was truly wise, he would have known that what I'm suffering through wasn't the best thing for me. Sometimes we believe that lie, don't we? He goes on to say, you see, envy declares that you would make a better ruler than the ruler of the universe. The Bible declares that to be false. There are dozens of stories in the Bible and in your own life that prove that the world is better off in the hands of the God than in the hands of man. Isn't that true? You see, as I read through Scripture through the week, as I prepare to deliver a message, before I really want to give any words for anyone else, I have to turn the spotlight of that passage into my own heart. And I didn't like what it showed me this week, church. Something that I was drawn back to, reminded of from years ago, just kind of popped up and made me feel about this big this week. So I hope that when you hear me talk about the fact that envy is a real thing, don't get the impression that I'm immune to it either. You see, I don't talk about this very often. I try not to make any message about us or about me, but in 2012, when we were expecting a little one 2 weeks before she was to be born, we found out she wouldn't live long. We got to spend 3 hours with our precious daughter, Ayla, before we gave her back to Jesus. And that was hard, and I didn't understand that suffering. But here's where envy comes in. You see, someone very close to us in our immediate family was also expecting at that time. And 2 months later, we got to watch someone else experience that blessing and that joy. And I couldn't handle it. And it broke my heart. And my wife, I love her so much, she was able to go in and help them get a nursery ready when we had just taken ours down. You see, envy can pop up even when no one's harmed us. How could you not be excited about what God's doing, a blessing in someone else's life, but we can become so fixated in what we didn't receive in ours? And can I tell you, for years I struggled with it. It was no fault of their own. But that's the way it works. It can creep in when we're trying to be holy, when we're trying to be righteous, when we're trying to do the right thing. Envy will rob you of your joy. It will make you feel like you have a better plan for your life than God does, and it will steal from you. It will steal relationships. It will steal your ability to live the life that God's created you to live. I'll tell you what, years later, I can look back on that now, and I can see why we had to walk that road. I can see what that peculiar glory that achieved in our lives. I can see why it had to take place, but I didn't have that peace at the time. You see, just as Joseph was in that pit, just as he was in that prison cell, there was a purpose in it. There was something that took place. You see, God broke me in that situation so that now, as I minister to people whose lives are broken, whose lives are going through suffering and pain, I had some commonality I could share with them. I had some way some common ground that I could reach out to them. In order to be an effective pastor, I had to go through a road that I didn't want to walk. So I hope that you know when I talk about the fact that envy will steal from you, I can speak from experience. And I still need to make peace with some things in that area. You see, envy is serious, folks. So what I want us to see here finally as we move forward, and maybe that's you today, maybe you've been convicted of something that's on your heart, something that you didn't even know you were harboring or holding on to. I want us to look at 4 cures 4 steps to produce a cure for jealousy. The first one is you got to realize it. You've got to confess it. You've got to acknowledge the fact that jealousy exists, that it's very real. You see, with envy, what we see is that we're not just obsessed with your own happiness. You actually can resent other people's happiness. Somehow the blessing that you receive becomes my curse, and that's how messed up it is, because that's not the truth. That's not God's truth. That's how bad it is. That's why Proverbs 27 verse 4 says that wrath is cruel, anger is outrageous, but who is able to stand before envy? You see, it pops up in our lives when we don't expect it, when we're not prepared for it, and it will consume us. The second thing that we need to do after we confess it, after we acknowledge it, after we really truly seek forgiveness for it, is we have to express gratitude for our blessings. You see, here's what I've grown to know. Even through that experience, that suffering is for a time. You know, I tell people every day that there is an eternity that I look forward to, and nothing that I have missed out on in this earth is going to be lost in eternity. There is a reunion to look forward to, and I cannot wait until that day. There is going to be a beautiful reunion, and all of the things that we suffer and all the trials that we go through are going to earn us a peculiar glory that we cannot see yet. But we also have to acknowledge that in the midst of it, we have so many blessings. We have so many things that we can be blessed, that we have been blessed through and blessed by, but we can take our eyes off of that. The third thing that we need to do is request a changed heart. We have to acknowledge, I've got this envy, I've got this bitterness, I've got this jealousy. I acknowledge it. I realize that you've given me so many blessings I could never deserve, and I desire for a new heart. I desire for a changed heart. I pray that you would increase my capacity to be able to love. And then here's the tough one. Here's the big step. And this is the one that will ultimately get you to a place where you can heal. And that is to pray for those that you envy. And it's hard. To find that person who you envy, whose jealousy is just consuming your life, and you absolutely thank God for what God is doing in their life. You pray for them with a genuine heart. You are truly, truly grateful for the blessings that they're receiving. So what this does is it allows us, no matter what environment we are in, no matter what choices other people have made, that you can live honorably. What Joseph did is he lived honorably regardless of his environment. Regardless of what has been done to us, how people have hurt us, what your kids have done, what your parents have done. You can never use those excuses because God has blessed you. God has something different for you, and you release that hurt. You release that jealousy. You release that, and you allow God to fill that place that jealousy took up with love. You see, you can't blame where you are today on other people's treatments of you. It's easy to do, and we're fond of doing that. We can say, I am the way I am or where I am because of things that people did to me, what one person did to me. But what we see is that God was with him. God was with them, and God is with you. And none of these things ultimately matter. The things we experience in life ultimately serve a purpose to further God's plans in our life, and that's a hard place to get. But we need to discover that we went through that pain so it could possibly bring healing to others. And so what we have to acknowledge here is that we are not a good ruler of our universe, but our God and Savior is. He knows what's best for us. And when we realize that we're just a part of his multifaceted plan, and we realize that he can use us as tools to be agents of grace in others' lives, what it does is it frees us up to live in a way that allows us to love others with the hope of Christ, with the message of Christ, the love of Christ, and that is truly life-changing. Would you pray with me?